Secretary of State, or Secretary-designate Marco Rubio, I guess, at this point, shredded globalists during his confirmation hearing by hammering their liberal world order as not just a fantasy, but a dangerous delusion. Well, historically, how far have globalists been willing to go to realize their dream of a world government? We're going to analyze that on today's edition of the Endtime Show. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dave Robbins with Endtime Ministries. Thank you for joining me on this edition of the Endtime Show. You know, prophecies predict the rise of a world government with the New World Order or liberal international order holding power until the second coming of Jesus Christ. Over the past several decades, we've witnessed the gradual formation of this global governing body. And historically, this is the point of my program today. Historically, how far are globalists willing to go to achieve their vision of a world government? What if somebody stands in the way of that? What actions would they be willing to take if someone attempted to block their progress? Could they resort to tactics like a Russian collusion spin, litigation against that person, impeachment of a president, or even an attempted assassination? Would they be willing to ignite a world war to advance their agenda or to prevent efforts aimed at derailing their pursuit of their global government? Oh man, wait till you hear the program that I put together for you today. I'm going to lay out some pretty compelling things talking about how far the globalists are willing to go. And we're watching it happen historically and as we speak. So just hold on. First, let me mention Birch Gold. You know, many of you, we've been holding our breath, right, for the past several months. We can finally exhale, hopefully. Work can finally be done on the major issues of our country, especially our national debt. Let's face it, you know, our nation's broke. And that is a huge house of cards that cannot be quickly dismantled. So you got to protect your savings, right? That's why we recommend birchgold.com/endtime. Many things are out of our control, and it's important to protect what you can, and that's your savings. Birch Gold Group can help you convert an IRA or a 401k to an IRA in physical gold. It doesn't cost you a penny out of pocket. So protect your savings with Birch Gold. Visit birchgold.com/endtime. So here's my question. Historically, you've seen it, how far have globalists been willing to go to achieve their vision of a world government? What actions would they be willing to take if someone attempted to block their progress? Again, I want to make sure you hear this. Would they be willing to resort to tactics like Russian collusion? Say, oh, no, didn't we live through all that? What about litigation against a sitting president? What about impeachment or even an attempted assassination? Would they be willing to ignite a world war to advance their agenda or to prevent efforts aimed at derailing somebody who was aiming to derailing their pursuit of a global governing body? What extent would they go to keep that person from being able to do that? They're going to have their world government. What if somebody wants to come along and upset their apple cart? To what extent would they go to stop that person? Senator Rubio, his confirmation hearing, he gave open remarks. And I want to go through, I just pulled just a few excerpts of that. Listen at this. He said, at the end of World War II, the United States was tasked with creating a world order. Out of the triumphalism at the end of a long Cold War emerged a bipartisan consensus that we had reached the end of history, that all the nations of the earth would become members of the democratic Western-led community, that a foreign policy that served the national interest could be could now be replaced by one that served the liberal world order, and that all mankind was now destined to abandon our national identities. The nation state would become obsolete, in other words, and we would become one human family or citizens of the world, even though the United States signed a Declaration of Independence, didn't we? Rubio goes on to say that wasn't just a fantasy, it was a dangerous delusion. What we're living through right now. The post-global order is not just obsolete. It is now a weapon that's being used against the United States. And all this has led us to a moment in which we must now confront the single greatest risk of geopolitical instability and generational global crisis in the lifetime of anyone alive in the Senate hearing today, all of us in America. He said, 8 decades later, we are called to create a free world out of chaos. This will not be easy. He's talking about the incoming Trump administration. He said, now President Trump, and I'm quoting here from Marco Rubio, now President Trump returns to the office with an unmistakable mandate from the voters. They want a strong America engaged in the world, but guided by a clear objective to promote peace abroad and security and prosperity here at home. That is the promise President Trump was elected to keep. Under President Trump, the top priority of the United States Department of State must be and will be the United States. Now, imagine being a globalist trying to establish a world governing body, believing that the nation state, or at least selling the propaganda that the nation state is obsolete. Imagine hearing what Senator Rubio just said, that the Trump administration is coming after you. We're going to be America first. And that goes against everything that a globalist, a person that believes in a world government, stands for. So, President Trump is a threat to the globalist efforts to establish a world government. Is it possible that they would be willing to start a world war to derail his America First agenda? Now, I know you're saying, oh, Dave, you're sensationalizing things. Well, just hold on a minute, because we're going to look back through history and bring you back up to today to show you that that is not that far out of somebody's wheelhouse. So, the situation in the world today is just like it was prior to World War III. Now, I've laid out the scenario many times. The answer to the international community, these globalists, to a world war is always world government. They knew they needed a big enough crisis. World War I led to the League of Nations. World War II led to the formation of the United Nations, world government. And now the United Nations is just a paper tiger. So they want this true dictatorial world governing body. So what do they need? It's not going to be a pandemic that gets us there. It appears, and this, in my opinion, that it's probably going to be a world war. Israel Hayam, they published an article, the moment World War III will begin. They're speculating. It says this, I just pulled some excerpts from the Middle East, from the middle of the Far East, from Europe to Africa. 2024 ended with an intensifying map of global conflicts, and the future looks grim. Are we witnessing the opening shots of another world war? Think about this. To have a world war, think about World War II. There were many different conflicts in the world, and eventually those were all tied together and ended up in a world war. You can't have one little conflict over here and one between two countries and that ends up in a world war. You're going to have many conflicts that connect, and then you have a world war. Well, Professor Danny Orbach, a military historian from the Hebrew University's History and Asian Studies Department, he published an article in July of 2023 and explaining that the world is on the brink of a war that could collapse the old order and provide a chilling forecast. What will come after the war is very hard to know, he said, but it will clearly be more interesting in the sinister sense of the word, worse and more chaotic. So Orbach states this, I'm quoting. He said, World War II began as a series of local conflicts that connected into one war. A local war between Germany and Poland became a regional war, which turned into a European war with Germany's invasion of the USSR. The war became global several months later. Here it is, and I'm going to go through this in great detail in a minute. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and the war between Japan and China connected through the United States of America to the war happening in Europe. It connected different conflicts, and we ended up in a world war. Well, guess what? That same scenario is playing out in our world today. Orbach goes on to say, and I'm quoting again, today we see three such local conflicts in the world. We see the tension between China and Taiwan, Russia versus Ukraine, Israel and Iran, and there's many other nations involved in that. And you've heard about the axis of evil. China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. All of these are tied together in one way or another. And Orbach goes on to say the great powers are involved in these conflicts. China is involved in its own and partially in others. Russia's involved in all three conflicts. And the United States is naturally involved in all three conflicts. So the danger is the connection, which could ignite and unite the three arenas into one large world war. It's the same thing that happened when World War III kicked off, or World War II. We're seeing the same thing happening right here just prior to World War III. The Bible says there's going to be a World War III. Revelation 9, verse 13 through 21. Loose the four angels bound in the great river Euphrates, for to kill a third part of all of mankind. In my opinion, World War III is the next thing to happen on God's prophetic timeline. It could be a peace agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I don't think it will be. And I haven't been able to pinpoint scripturally which one happens first, but I know those are the next two. And it looks like World War III is staring us right in the face, folks, if it hasn't already begun. So when I ask you the original question, how far would the globalists go to make sure they got their agenda across the finish line? They want a true dictatorial, totalitarian world government. The Bible says there's going to be one. There are people in the world today that are willing to go to great lengths, even at the expense of human life, to get their agendas across the finish line, to have this world order. They knew when World War II kicked off, the United States would not get involved. So they had to have a crisis big enough to where the people of the United States would be willing to back the United States getting involved in World War II. And so the globalists provided that scenario. And it just happened to be Pearl Harbor. But I've got articles that say Pearl Harbor was necessary for the world order. So, my question today, Donald Trump is coming out against the world order in his America First agenda. At what lengths are they willing to go to? A Russian collusion, a litigation against him and his family, the impeachment, the assassination attempts. What length would they go to stop Donald Trump and his agenda? Well, listen at this. Historytools.org, they published an article. Why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? A historian's perspective. I want you to listen to this very closely. It says the attack on Pearl Harbor, I'm quoting from the article. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a pivotal moment in history, marking the United States' entry into World War II, here it is, and setting the stage for a global conflict that would reshape the world order. Remember, on the heels of World War II, we have what was called the second effort of a world government, which was the United Nations. The United Nations is the seat of world government in the earth today. So this article says World War II the Pearl Harbor was a necessary step, setting the stage for this global conflict, getting the United States involved in this, because when the League of Nations was formed, Woodrow Wilson couldn't bring the Congress, the United States, in on it, so it failed. They knew they had to have the United States on board with this. Well, the Union came out, the Union news source, with an article. The title of the article, How the Attack on Pearl Harbor Shaped America's Role in the World. Listen at this, and I'm quoting, folks. The bombing of Pearl Harbor was a pivotal moment in the U.S. and world history. The attack thrust the United States into World War II and set in motion a series of events that would transform the country into a global superpower and guardian of the international order. Pearl Harbor, 76 years later, this legacy of Pearl Harbor now faces perhaps its biggest challenge. Japan killed 2,403 Americans on December 7th, 1941. More than 400,000 U.S. soldiers would die in the 4 years that followed that. But listen closely. Their blood helped purchase the defeat of fascism in Europe and Asia and laid the foundations for a post-war international order made in America's image. Are you hearing what I'm saying, everybody? Now, I've laid out the scenario for years, and I'm going to go through this next part in great detail. I'm going to take the rest of my program to lay out a scenario for you, because I've stated for years, again, that World War I happened, and on the heels of that, they had to have a big enough crisis to get America involved in this world governing body so that the nations of the world would yield up their sovereignty. So World War I happens. World War I ended in 1918, and January of 2020, the League of Nations is formed. Of course, that failed. So World War I wasn't a big enough crisis. 20 years later, World War II comes along, and it wasn't just over 8 million killed this time, it was over 52 million. But the United States was dragging her feet. Pearl Harbor was the event that got us involved in World War II. But the goal was world government. FDR, President of the United States, he had already put New World Order, Novus Ordo Seclorum, in the ribbon under the pyramid with the all-seeing eye on our dollar bill back in 1935. World War II didn't begin until 1938, and it lasted to 1945. On the heels of that same year, the concentration camps were liberated in 1945 in Europe, and the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. That same year in September, we signed the United Nations Charter. So the goal, world government, but you got to have a big enough crisis, and you've got to have America on board. So I just read you a couple articles that said that Pearl Harbor was the thing that launched us, that helped shape and get us involved in all this, that ended up shaping us in getting us involved in this new world order. We were the principal driver. However, I want to talk to you about Pearl Harbor today, because I tried to put my fingers on. I hadn't read any books. I'd just been searching the internet for years trying to find documentation that FDR was complicit and knew about Pearl Harbor before it happened. And, you know, if you had a family member that passed away there, you know, I'm sorry for your loss. It was a horrible, horrible thing, especially the reason that it happened. But the reason I want to go through this next part here is because I want you to understand that our FDR knew Pearl Harbor was going to happen and allowed it to happen. I know that's a strong statement, but I'm going to go off the New American article. These guys are very reliable source, the New American. And the title of this article is Pearl Harbor, Hawaii was surprised, but FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was not. The article is by James Perloff, P-E-R-L-O-F-F, and it was published December 7th. Of course, Pearl Harbor happened December 7th, 1941. So I want to go through this because I want you to understand at what length would people go to realize their dream of a world governing body. FDR was a globalist. He put New World Order on our dollar bill in 1935. He was a globalist. He was complicit. He knew the United States had to get involved in World War II. So, here's what happened, and I pulled a bunch of excerpts. This article was huge. I've only got, I just pulled it, just some excerpts of it. But I pulled enough that I wanted you to understand really what was going on here. Because, why? There's a world governing body that's being established right now. And Donald Trump, as the incoming president of the United States, is saying, no, we're not going to be a part of that. And if he does like he did the first 4 years, immediately he's going to start pulling us out of that. And Marco Rubio just testified and said, hey, that this world order is a very bad thing. It's being sold as a good thing, but it's delusional. It's a horrific thing. And that Donald Trump is going to be against that. Well, Marco Rubio is going to be Donald Trump's Secretary of State if everything works out. And so he would be in as a foreign affairs advisor and a lot of different things to Trump. So Donald Trump is surrounding himself with people who are going to be America first. And so it's very important that we understand these guys, the globalists, are willing to do a Pearl Harbor to get United States involved in this stuff. What lengths are they willing to go to derail Trump this time? The Bible says there's going to be a world governing body, but I want to lay out the scenario for you. So here's what happened. On Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Japan launched, supposedly, to some it was not a sneak attack, but to some it was. To those on Pearl Harbor, it was. Japan launched their sneak attack on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, shattered the peace of a beautiful Hawaiian morning, and it left much of our United States Pacific Fleet broken and burning. The destruction and death that the Japanese military visited upon Pearl Harbor that day was horrific. There were 18 naval vessels, including 8 battleships, that were sunk or heavily damaged. 188 planes were destroyed. Over 2,000 of our servicemen were killed. And again, if you had somebody involved in that, I'm sorry for your loss. It was horrific. I think there are a few of those people that are left alive. I believe there are. But this was exacerbated by the fact that American commanders in Hawaii were caught by surprise. But that was not the case in Washington. And again, I'm laying out the scenario because there were people that knew, hey, we've got to have America on board with this world governing body, so she's got to be involved in this World War II. And Pearl Harbor was the thing that got us involved in World War II. And Washington knew that it was coming. So the article goes on to say that comprehensive research has shown not only that Washington knew in advance of the attack, but that it deliberately withheld its foreknowledge from our commanders in Hawaii in the hope that the surprise attack would catapult the United States into World War II. Now, it pains me to even talk about this because I know a lot of us have had a grandpa or a great-grandpa or somebody that was involved in the war, but I want you to understand what we're facing here with the incoming Trump administration. You've seen what they were willing to do early on to realize, because Donald Trump just wasn't against the establishment here in America. He was against an international establishment as well, world government. He was against the United Nations. He was pulling us out of the Global Compact on Migration, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Paris Climate Agreement. I mean, one thing right after another, and the World Health Organization. And they were just livid. And they'd done everything they could to try to get rid of him. Well, now he got reelected. And he's coming back in. And again, what lengths are they willing to go to realize their dream, their goal, their vision of this world governing body. Something we need to watch and to pray for, because we don't want to be part of a world governing body in the end time. We signed a Declaration of Independence, not interdependence. We don't want to be ran by a world governing body, some kind of a foreign entity. No, something that's totally anti-Semitic and anti-U.S. If we started bucking against that, they'll turn on us on a dime. We supply most of the funding for the United Nations at this point. But what if we were to defund the United Nations? What would happen then? They would turn on us tomorrow, folks. So, this surprise attack that it would catapult us into the U.S. into World War II. Although Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR from now on, desired to directly involve the United States in the Second World War, his intentions sharply contradicted his public pronouncements. A pre-war Gallup poll showed that 88% of the Americans opposed the United States involvement in the European War. Citizens realized that the United States participation in World War I had not made a better world. And in 1940, the election year, in his speech, Roosevelt typically stated, and I'm quoting, he said, "I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." But privately, the president planned the opposite. So what I want to do is to give you a little background to the betrayal, because most of you don't know this story. And I want you to know it, because I want you to know and understand what length would they go to realize their dream of a world governing body where all the nations of the world on board. They had to have the United Nations on board, or the United States. And Pearl Harbor was the thing that got us kicked off into that. But 88% of the United States population didn't want us to do it. But they knew if they had a big enough crisis that the United States population would get on board with it. That crisis was Pearl Harbor. And I'm going to get deep off into this on the backside of the break, so don't touch that dial.
A reminder of the breaking news this hour. At least 22 people are reported to have died in a strike in Gaza.
The rise of Islam.
We're trying to bring answers for so many families desperately.
Is the Israel-Hamas-Iran conflict World War III? So let's talk about the four horsemen. What do these horses symbolize? These are the four spirits of the heavens which go forth from standing before the Lord of all the earth. In the end time, the true people of God will not be weak, anemic, and defeated. These prophesied events are revealing we are quickly approaching the time of the Great Tribulation right now.
Now streaming on OneSource and available to order at endtime.com/screen. Go to endtime.com/screen or call 800-ENDTIME.
What if you could understand Bible prophecy? Dave Robbins, the host of the End Time Show's TV and radio programs, is holding a free prophecy conference near you. Gain peace and understanding about what the Bible says concerning end time prophecy. Call 1-800-ENDTIME or go to endtime.com/events to see when Dave will be in a location near you.
Again, globalist, FDR, wanting to establish a world governing body. He was a globalist. And he was saying, hey, folks, in the 1940 election speeches, your kids aren't going to war, never going to happen. But that's not what was going on in his mind behind the scene, right? Roosevelt's intentions were nearly exposed in 1940 when Tyler Kent, he was a code clerk at the U.S. Embassy in London, he discovered secret dispatches between Roosevelt and Churchill. And these revealed that FDR, despite contrary campaign promises, was determined to engage America in the war. Kent, he smuggled some of the documents out of the embassy, hoping to alert the American public, but he was caught. And with the U.S. government approval, he was tried in a secret British court and confined to a British prison all the way until the war was finished. During World War II's early days, the president offered numerous provocations to Germany. He was freezing their assets, shipping 50 destroyers to Britain, and, depth charging U-boats and different things. The Germans did not retaliate, however. They knew America's entry into World War I had shifted the balance of power against them, and they shunned a repeat of that scenario. FDR, therefore, switched his focus to Japan. Japan had, now listen closely, you guys, some of this stuff was new to me till I read the article. Japan had signed a mutual defense pact with Germany. You say, how are all these different conflicts around the world tied in together? Why did Pearl Harbor happen and we end up going to war in Europe? Because they were all tied together, and that's the same scenario that's playing out in our world right now. Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, the Middle East, all of those guys are tied together, okay? That's why, and the Bible says World War III is one of the next things on God's prophetic timeline. So, Japan had signed a mutual defense pact with Germany and Italy. It's the tripartite treaty. Roosevelt knew that if Japan went to war with the United States, that Germany and Italy would be compelled to declare war on America, and thus entangling us in the European conflict by the back door. After Pearl Harbor happened, we went to war with the Japanese in the Pacific and Europe, right? So as Harold Eichel's Secretary of the Interior said back in October of 1941, that for a long time I have believed that our best entrance into the war would be by way of Japan. Now, much new light has been shed on Pearl Harbor through the recent work of a guy named Robert B. Stinnett. He was a World War II Navy veteran, and Stinnett he's obtained numerous relevant documents through the Freedom of Information Act, and there's a book, In Day of Deceit, The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor. It was published back in 2000. The book so brusquely dismissed by Director Bruckheimer that Stinnett reveals that Roosevelt's plan to provoke Japan began with a memorandum from a guy named Lieutenant Commander Arthur H. McCollum. He was head of the Far East Desk of the Office of Naval Intelligence. The memorandum advocated 8 actions predicted to lead Japan into attacking the United States. So all this was pre-planned. None of this happened by accident. McCollum wrote this, I'm quoting, he said, if by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better. Well, guess what? FDR enacted all 8 of McCollum's provocative steps and more. So this was all pre-planned, everybody, to get us involved so that we could we could shape a world order here. While no one can excuse Japan's belligerence in those days, it is also true that our government provoked Japan in various ways. We froze their assets in America, closing the Panama Canal to Japan shipping, progressively halting vital exports to Japan until we finally joined Britain in an all-out embargo, sending a hostile note to the Japanese ambassador implying military threats if Tokyo did not alter its Pacific policies. And on November 26th, just 11 days before the Japanese attacked, delivering an ultimatum that demanded as prerequisites to resumed trade that Japan withdraw all troops from China, Indochina, and in effect abrogate her tripartite treaty with Germany and Italy. Well, no, of course she wasn't going to do that. So we were kind of just poking her. Come on. Well, after meeting with President Roosevelt on October 16, 1941, Secretary of War Henry Stimson wrote in his diary, I'm quoting here, he said, "We face the delicate question of the diplomatic fencing to be done so as to be sure Japan is put into the wrong and makes the first bad move, the overt move. We had to make sure that Japan made the move, and then America would say, hey, Japan fired off on us, let's go." And that's exactly what happened. On November 25th, the day before the ultimatum was sent to Japan's ambassadors, Stimson wrote in his diary, the question was how we should maneuver them, the Japanese, into the position of firing the first shot. That was very important because America had to get on board with this. So Japan had to attack us, and then the American people would say, let's go to war. Well, the bait that was offered Japan was the United States Pacific Fleet. In 1940, Admiral J.O. Richardson, the fleet's commander, he flew to Washington to protest FDR's decision to permanently base the fleet in Hawaii instead of its normal berthing on the U.S. West Coast. The admiral, and many guys in our military were against that. The admiral had sound reasons. Pearl Harbor was vulnerable to attack from 360 degrees, and it was approachable from any direction, and it could not be effectively rigged with nets and baffles to defend against torpedoes and planes. And in Hawaii, it would be hard to supply, and it would be hard to supply and then train crews for his undermanned vessels. It would be hard to get all that. So Pearl Harbor also lacked adequate fuel supplies and dry docks, and keeping their men far from their families and would create morale problems and all kinds of stuff. So the argument became heated. And Richardson said, I came away with the impression that despite what we talked about, FDR, the President of the United States, was fully determined to put the United States into the war with Great Britain, and that we could hold out until he was reelected. So FDR was totally complicit in all of this. So, of course, Richardson was quickly relieved of his command because he was balking against this. And replacing him was Admiral Husband E. Kimmel. Now, Kimmel also informed Roosevelt of Pearl Harbor's deficiencies, but accepted placement there. And he was trusting that Washington would notify him of any intelligence point to attack. Well, unfortunately, this proved to be misplaced trust, didn't it? Because Washington watched Japan preparing to assault Pearl Harbor, and Admiral Kimmel, and they were watching this as well as his Army counterpart in Hawaii. So his name was General Walter C. Short. They were completely sealed off from the information pipeline. Now imagine that. Now, I want you to understand all of this prior knowledge, because one of the most important elements in America's foreknowledge of Japan's intentions was our government's success in cracking Japan's secret diplomatic code known as Purple. Tokyo used it to communicate to its embassies and consulates, including those in Washington and Hawaii. And the code was so complex that it was enciphered and deciphered by a machine. So, a talented group of American crypto analysts broke the code in 1940, and they devised a facsimile of the Japanese machine, and they decoded this thing. They broke the code. So these utilized by the intelligence sections of both the War and Navy departments, swiftly revealed Japan's diplomatic messages. The deciphered texts were nicknamed Magic. So, copies of Magic were always promptly delivered in locked pouches to President Roosevelt and the Secretaries of State, War and Navy. They also went to Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall and to the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Harold Stark. Here's the problem. However, although 3 purple decoding machines were allotted to Britain, none was sent to Pearl Harbor, who was out there in the middle of the Pacific. So, intercepts of ciphered messages radio between Tokyo and its Honolulu consulate had to be forwarded to Washington for decrypting because Hawaii didn't have any of these machines. Thus, Kimmel and Short, the Hawaiian commanders, they were at the mercy of Washington for feedback, and a request for their own decoding machine was rebuffed on the grounds that diplomatic traffic was of insufficient interest to soldiers. So, how untrue that was? Well, on October 9th, 1941, the War Department decoded a Tokyo to Honolulu dispatch instructing the Consul General to divide Pearl Harbor into 5 specific areas to report the exact location of American ships that were located there. And there's nothing unusual about spies watching ship movements. That happens all over the world. But reporting precise whereabouts of ships in dock has only one implication, doesn't it? Charles Willoughby, Douglas MacArthur's chief of intelligence, he later wrote that the reports were on a grid system of the inner harbor with coordinate locations of American men of war. So the coordinate grid is the classical method for to pinpoint target designation of our battleships had suddenly become targets, is what's going on here. And this information was never sent to our commanders in Hawaii, Kimmel or Short. And so you can see how there was a plan going on here behind the scenes. What are they trying to do? They're trying to get America involved in World War II. The 88% of the American people did not want to do that. And FDR told them during an election year in 1940, oh, none of your boys are going to go to this war. But that was the plan was already set in motion, everybody. So at what lengths are these globalists willing to go to? This was prior to World War II, or during World War II. Guess what? The Bible says World War III is coming, and Donald Trump is totally against world government.
The Roman government controlled the world, so many people were looking for a different Messiah, a rescuing Messiah. Remember the story of the woman at the well. The woman saith unto him, I know that Messiah cometh, which is called Christ. And Jesus said unto her, I that speak unto thee am he. Jesus very clearly stated that he was God and that he was the Messiah. We're even more blessed because we haven't seen those things, but yet we believe. When Jesus cried out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He knew every one of these prophecies had to be fulfilled. He said, it is finished.
Now streaming on OneSource and available to order at endtime.com/revealed. Go to endtime.com/revealed or call 800-ENDTIME.
You know, everyone, I'm not enjoying talking about this, just to be honest with you. I mean, it shows me that there are people that are willing to go to the extent to realize their goal and dream and vision of a world government to the point where human life becomes just, you're just expendable. Human life means nothing to these people. And you say, well, there's nobody like that on the earth today. Oh, man, you know, if you think that, that's just because you're not following the news. There are people on the earth today that are willing, they would be willing to go into World War III tomorrow morning to realize their dreams and goals and visions of a world governing body. Look at what they did to make sure they had the United States on board with everything back in 1941. Well, now here we are in 2025. And we've got an incoming president he's coming in just willing to just upset the apple cart of the whole thing. And I'm sitting here going, you know what? The Bible says World War III is coming. I'm wondering what last time it was a COVID situation, right? I heard an interview that Donald Trump said that our economy was screaming, everything was rolling, gas prices are down, and then COVID hit. And he said, and then my attention had to be averted to that. Well, look at Robert Kennedy Jr. If everything works out, he's going to be over Health and Human Services. I don't think they'll be able to do another COVID situation here because he's not going to get in front of the American people and say, put on your mask and take vaccines and do all this other. So, what extent, this is my original question, what extent are the globalists willing to go to realize their dream and goal and vision of this world governing body? Are they willing to push us off into a World War III? It's a question that I have, and I wanted to propose it to you. It's something that we need to be watching for in this incoming administration, because they've tried everything else: litigation, the Russian collusion, they tried impeachment, somebody's tried to assassinate him two or three times, and none of that's worked. So at what extent are they willing to go to derail the Trump train? And so we'll have to see. And, you know, God help us all, right? I'm trusting in God, but I know World War III is coming. It's prophesied in the Bible, but so is this world government. So I'm trusting in God for all of it, but I'm still watching, right? So I wanted to go through a little bit more of the story because it's so important. I want you to understand really what happened back in how far, the extent they're willing to go through, the lies, the deception, and things they're willing to go to make sure America's on board with this thing and that we stay aligned with the globalist leaders. So there was a gentleman, as the guy, Robert Stinnett, he has revealed that Washington was not only deciphering these Japanese diplomatic messages, but naval dispatches as well. President Roosevelt had access to these intercepts via his the routing officer. It was Lieutenant Commander McCullum. So this guy had authored the original 8-point plan of provocation to Japan. So much secrecy has surrounded these naval dispatches that their existence was not revealed during any of the 10 Pearl Harbor investigations. Even the mini probe Congress conducted in 1995. Most of Stinnett's requests for documents concerning Pearl Harbor have been denied as still classified, even under the Freedom of Information Act. So none of us have the 100% full story, right? There's a lot of stuff that's been exposed, but imagine if you had the entire story. So it was long presumed that as the Japanese fleet approached Pearl Harbor, it maintained complete radio silence, but that's not true. The fleet barely observed discretion, let alone silence. Naval intelligence intercepted and translated numerous dispatches, some clearly revealing that Pearl Harbor had been targeted. And the most significant was one that was sent by Admiral Yamamoto to the Japanese First Air Fleet on, it was November 26th of 1941. The task force that was keeping its movement strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft, it says, shall advance into Hawaiian waters. And upon the very opening of hostilities, shall attack the main force of the United States fleet and deal it a mortal blow. The first air raid is planned for the dawn of X day. Exact date is to be given at a later order. So on November 29th, Secretary of State, now if our guys out in Hawaii, the commanders, would have known about this, they could have pulled our fleet out of there and got them back to the mainland, right? They were never told. On November 29th, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, he secretly met with freelance newspaper writer Joseph Lieb. Lieb had formerly held several posts in the Roosevelt administration. Well, Hull knew him and felt that he was one newsman that he could trust. And the Secretary of State handed him copies of some of the Tokyo intercepts concerning Pearl Harbor. Well, he said the Japanese were planning to strike the base and that FDR planned to let it happen. Well, Hull made Lieb pledge to keep his name out of it, but hoped that he would blow the story sky high in the newspapers. Well, Lieb ran to the office of his friend Lyle Wilson, the Washington bureau chief of United Press. And while keeping his pledge to Hull, he told Wilson the details and showed him the intercepts. Wilson replied that the story was ludicrous and refused to run it. It could have all been exposed. Well, through connections, Lieb managed to get a hurried version onto the to United Press's foreign cable, but only one newspaper carried any part of it. So after Pearl Harbor, Lyle Wilson called Lieb to his office. He handed him a copy of FDR's just-released Day of Infamy speech, and the two men wept. Lieb recounted his story in the History Channel documentary. It's called Sacrifice at Pearl Harbor. And that's what it was. It was a sacrifice. And I want to get to a point here where I want to talk to something that represents just a sampling of the evidence that Washington knew in advance of the Pearl Harbor attack. I wanted you to hear this. But however, none of this information was passed to our commanders in Hawaii, Kimmel or Short, with the exception of Ambassador Gru's January warning, a copy of which reached Kimmel on February 1st. And to allay any concerns, Lieutenant Commander McCullum, who originated the plan to incite Japan to war, he wrote Kimmel and he said, and I'm quoting, he said, "Naval intelligence places no credence on those rumors. Furthermore, based on known data regarding the present disposition and deployment of Japanese naval and army forces, no move against Pearl Harbor appears imminent or planned for the foreseeable future." Can you imagine that? And allowing these people to be out there in Pearl Harbor as sitting ducks, everybody. So to ensure a successful Japanese attack, one that would enrage America into joining the war, that was the goal. Because America had to be on board with this. It was vital to keep Kimmel and Short out of the intelligence loop. And however, Washington did far more than this to facilitate the Japanese assault. On November 25th, approximately 1 hour after the Japanese attack, their attack force left their port for Hawaii, the U.S. Navy issued an order forbidding U.S. and Allied shipping travel via the North Pacific. All trans-Pacific shipping was rerouted through the South Pacific. And this order even applied to Russian ships docked in the American West Coast. Can't go north, you got to go south. The purpose is easy to fathom, right? I mean, if any commercial ship accidentally stumbled on the Japanese task force, it might alert Pearl Harbor. And so all this was pre-planned. There's a guy named Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner. He was the Navy's War Plans officer in 1941. He said this, I'm quoting, he said, "We were prepared to divert traffic when we believed the war was imminent. We sent the traffic down via the Torres Strait so that the track of the Japanese task force would be clear of any traffic." So the Hawaiian commanders have traditionally been censored for failing to detect the approaching Japanese carriers. Well, what goes unsaid is that Washington denied them the means to do that. An army marching overland toward the target, towards a target that's easily spotted, right? But Hawaii's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. and its approaches are limitless and uninhabited. So during the week before December 7th, naval aircraft searched more than 2 million square miles of the Pacific, but they never saw the Japanese force. And this is because Kimmel and Short, they had only enough planes to survey 1/3 of the 360-degree arc around them. And intelligence had advised incorrectly that they should concentrate on the southwest, but that was not where the attack was coming from. And also their radar was insufficient. They were not enough. There were not enough trained surveillance pilots. Many of the reconnaissance craft were old and suffered from a lack of spare parts. The commander's repeated requests to Washington for additional patrol planes, they were turned down. And the Navy had traditionally followed the rule that when international relations are critical, that the fleet puts to sea. Well, this is exactly what Admiral Kimmel did. Aware that the U.S.-Japanese relations were deteriorating, he sent 46 warships safely into the North Pacific in late November 1941 without notifying Washington. And he even ordered the fleet to conduct a mock air raid on Pearl Harbor, clairvoyantly selecting the same launch site Admiral Yamamoto chose 2 weeks later. But when the White House learned that Kimmel's move, it countermanded his orders and ordered all ships returned to the dock, using the dubious excuse that Kimmel's actions might provoke the Japanese. And Washington knew that if the two fleets met at sea and engaged each other, there might be questions about who fired the first shot. Now, the commanders didn't give up. They did a lot of different things, and they tried to, figure out what was going on, but the intelligence just wasn't flowing their way. And then, on December 7th, 1941, Japan launched their attack on our U.S. Pacific fleet at Pearl Harbor. And, of course, about 2,000 servicemen were killed. Horrific. They blew up 188 planes, 18 naval vessels, including 8 battleships. Just horrific. So much lives lost that could have been prevented, but somebody had an agenda that wanted a world governing body, and they knew we had to get involved in World War II to make all that stuff happen. And so, again, at what lengths are people willing to go through at the expense of human life to realize their world governing body? Well, the Bible says there's a World War III coming, and if you look in most of the major news sources, especially overseas, everybody's talking about a potential World War III, and the stage is set. Many different conflict zones in the world connected together. God help us all to be in His will in these last days. God bless.